Hi, my name is Paul VanderKlay, and it's a pleasure to be included in your conference. Some of you know me because you've watched some of my videos. Others of you don't know me at all. If you know me, this setting is familiar. If you don't know me, well, then I'm coming to you from the corner of my office now in COVID-fearful California. I thought I might begin with a little bit of introduction for those of you who don't know me. My story in some ways will be weaved in and out of this presentation. The format that I'm using is the format I usually use for my videos. I developed it basically as an enlarged learning process to engage with the work of Jordan Peterson and a number of other thought leaders. And I found a way to do it sort of from my own little office on YouTube. So who is Paul VanderKlay, and what might he have to say to our moment? On my YouTube channel, there's a introductory YouTube that goes through a little bit of the history of the channel and how I got doing this. I'll compress a lot of that into just a few slides. I'm a third-generation minister in the Christian Reformed Church of North America. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Christian Reformed Church of North America, we are basically an offshoot of the Dutch Reformed State Church, split off in North America in the middle of the 19th century. My grandfather was the first of us to become a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. He pastored in a number of rural places during the Depression, up in Canada just after the Second World War, and then Long Island and Vermont, finishing up his career. My father spent most of his career in Paterson, New Jersey, turning sort of a gospel-saving Christian Reformed chapel into a church, and spent 36 years there doing that. And that was the context for my introduction to the faith and my introduction to ministry. After my education at Calvin College, where I got a degree in history, and my Master's of Divinity from Calvin Theological Seminary, I spent 6 years in the Dominican Republic, and since then I've spent now almost 25 years ministering in a small multi-everything congregation in Sacramento, California. I did most of this, semi-known in my own denomination. I ran a blog for a number of years, but then when the Jordan Peterson phenomenon arose, and I got interested in it, I thought I'd play around a little bit with YouTube. And when I played around with YouTube, I developed something of a following, basically doing commentary videos on Jordan Peterson's biblical series. That has expanded in a lot of different ways. And now I'm doing a lot of this effort to try to promote and organize networks of people, hopefully having satisfying and meaningful conversations with each other. I continue to use my YouTube for conversations with randos, as they sometimes call themselves, people who have questions or interests, and I keep sort of an open line to the internet where I will have conversations and often post videos with these individuals. I have videos where I'm basically thinking out loud, exploring many of these issues, and I've found this to be a tremendously helpful learning process. And also videos where I continue to do commentaries and conversations, sometimes with higher status, more visible people. But I've discovered that creating a space for these kinds of conversations is probably the most productive and fruitful ministry I can do for God's kingdom right now. Recently, Jordan Peterson released a video where he was in conversation with John Vervaeke, a colleague of his from the University of Toronto, where Jordan Peterson used to teach. Jonathan Pajot, who is a French-Canadian artist and YouTuber exploring the symbolic world, as he calls it, and Bishop Barron, who is a Roman Catholic bishop in California, where he founded and is really the flagship for a ministry called Word on Fire. In that video, John Vervaeke noted that, and I haven't fact-checked this, and we'll see what the Omicron virus does, but more people in Australia have died during the COVID epidemic from suicide than actually from COVID-19. Now, modernity proceeds on the assumption that human beings were animals, and that if you covered our basic needs, our basic material wants, then we would be satisfied and we would simply flourish. Of course, Dostoevsky knocked the legs out from this argument a good while ago, but Jesus did it first. When Jesus, under the temptation of the devil, said, "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God," we probably should have listened to him, because that's essentially the same point. And now that those of us who live in affluent nations with at least reasonably secure health care and entertainments and comforts, the likes of which would have made European monarchs just a couple of hundred years ago desirous of our condition, well, we're beginning to awaken to this as well. One of the things that I began to notice when I began talking to people who were interested in Jordan Peterson was a story repeated by a good number of some of the first people that found me when I started making videos. And today I call it something to the effect of nihilism-induced depression. So I made videos about Jordan Peterson's biblical series. People would contact me and want to have a conversation. Some of those people would agree to allow me to share that conversation on my channel, and an entire community developed around me. A common theme in that community from many individuals were that they were depressed, and somehow watching and listening to Jordan Peterson content, especially the biblical series and his classroom lectures, relieved them of depression. That is a strange thing. Jordan Peterson himself made a name by being a bit of an accountability and responsibility advocate, telling people to clean their room, to start setting goals and shaping up and make something of their lives. He had been a clinical psychologist, and part of what he had seen, I'm sure, is part of what probably many of us have seen, that in our affluence, a younger generation has figured out that, well, if the world gives them some resistance, and if there's enough money and a good enough high-speed internet connection, well, maybe the most meaningful thing you can do is live in your parents' home and play video games all day. Now, some of you will relate to this, either because it's your children or because it's you. I grabbed this little still out of an after-school SKOOL video talking about Jordan Peterson's responsibility preachings. And here you had basically an old infant, somebody in their 30s and 40s that never really got off the couch, eats junk food, plays computer games all day, watches porn, but the parents are a little bewildered because probably when they were growing up, their life didn't afford such affluence. But they look at their son and say, this isn't what we hope for from his life. He might feel meaning, the kinds of meaning he finds in video games. He might feel a sense of purpose and urgency, but it's all virtual and online, and none of it is paying out in his real life, in a life that all of us can see, and in fact, in a material world that we can participate in. Now, this isn't a new thing. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl, for the generation following the Second World War, in many ways was working the same terrain that Jordan Peterson has been working since. Meaning is a reliable treatment for suffering. Always has been. People will readily exchange money, power, influence, and comfort for meaning. Viktor Frankl figured this out in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. He saw firsthand that people who had lost any sense of meaning simply died, and those who survived the horrors of the concentration camps almost always had a reason. And if you have a reason, you can survive almost anything. And so Viktor Frankl, in fact, founded an entire school of psychiatric therapy on the pursuit of meaning. Help someone find something meaningful, and their life will improve, and their affect will improve as well. Certain kinds of life struggles reliably put us into a space where we are driven towards meaningful pursuits. I was quite amazed in the first chapters of my professional vocational ministry, where I was working with Haitians, many of whom were illegal laborers in the Dominican Republic, that I seldom heard about suicide. These people had remarkably difficult and chaotic lives. They would often fall prey to police officers or military who would shake them down and take their few possessions. They were subject to all sorts of discrimination and oppression, but yet they continued to engage life, and at least with the church communities that I was working in, pursue God and pursue their life with a great amount of meaning. That meaning directly affected the suffering that they had to endure. And then going back to the more affluent places of the world to discover that people who had really no concerns about food on the table or a shelter over their head, they would decide it was better to end their life simply because life felt meaningless. Part of the meaning crisis is attributable to affluenza. Suicide, it seems, stalks the materially comfortable. Now, a while after I started making videos about Jordan Peterson, some of the people that I had been engaging in my channel began to suggest that I begin talking to John Vervaeke. Again, John Vervaeke teaches psychology and cognitive science at University of Toronto and was a colleague of Jordan Peterson's when Jordan Peterson was an active professor there and had been doing some of his own writing about this. And it was John Vervaeke who gave me the phrase, the meaning crisis. And since then, John Vervaeke himself has taken to YouTube, and I've had a number of conversations with him, as we have with Jonathan Peugeot and a number of individuals, to explore this. Now, John Vervaeke, if you dig much into his story, you can get some of his story from my video introduction about him. He grew up in a fundamentalist household and in some ways was scared to death and traumatized by this community with their continual obsession over eternal judgment and the rapture. And on the basis of this, he decided to leave behind Christianity, and he's pursued a lot of other religious and spiritual pursuits over his lifetime: Eastern philosophies, Eastern religions, cognitive science, and is currently pursuing a contemporary remix of Neoplatonism. He considers himself a non-theist. And if you're curious about that, you can see some of my more recent conversations with him where we've explored this and even, in fact, explored some of the interesting comparisons between his non-theism and classical theism, as I've discussed with some Roman Catholic scholars in particular. What he's been mapping out, however, are the deeper, broader philosophical religious crisis that has been brewing for 1,000 years. He relates a lot of this to the rise of nominalism and sees nominalism come into the church through Occam and Scotus, the Protestant Reformation, and beyond. And so, again, this has been the subject of a number of my dialogues with him. This really isn't too far from a lot of the concerns of C.S. Lewis, who obviously wrote in the second part, in the middle and latter part, the middle of the 20th century, let's say. In his book, The Discarded Image, Lewis talks about how this classical medieval view of the world provided a great deal of meaning to people who were suffering through the ordinary existences of the medieval period, and that modernity, in fact, has, for all of the comforts given us, has caused us a number of problems. A piece that I discovered a number of years ago by Peter Kraft, who actually grew up in the Reformed Church of America near me in New Jersey, went to the same high school and college I did, but then left his Reformed faith and became a Roman Catholic scholar and a Roman Catholic philosopher, summed it up quite nicely in a piece that you can find in a variety of forms on the internet. This is from, you can find it on various Catholic websites pertaining to suffering. There's an Audible version called The Dark Side. And he lays out a few things here, again connecting this to Viktor Frankl. To live is to suffer. That was Buddha's first noble truth. The truth that he thought was the most obvious and indispensable truth in life. The data on which any quasi-scientific theory of human life must be erected. Pain is the most obvious problem in the world. This is no less true today. For now that our civilization has succeeded in conquering half of humanity's physical pains by anesthetics and medical technology and boogie boards, it has also doubled humanity's spiritual pains: depression, despair, divorce, which is more painful than death, other betrayals, loneliness, emptiness, meaninglessness, the existential vacuum. As Viktor Frankl says, quoting Nietzsche, a man can endure almost any how if only he has a why. The how is the circumstances, including the suffering. The why is a purpose and a meaning. This is not a theory, it is an observation. Frankl is a scientist. He observed this to be true in the laboratory of Auschwitz. The corollary of this truth is that if we do not have a purpose and a meaning, then we cannot endure any suffering that's inconvenient. Our culture seems to have made a Faustian bargain by giving up a better why for a better how, giving up meaning for comfort. We've conquered the world of pain, but we've lost our soul, our meaning, our hope, our purpose. And that's why the physical pains that remain, though only half as bad in quantity compared to those of our ancestors, is twice as bad in quality, twice as unendurable, without the meaning to surround them. The end result is that though the pains are less, we fear them and feel them more. It's like the difference between childbirth and abortion. To use a quantitative analogy for some that is not quantitative, the birth has 100 pains, but 1,000 transcendently meaningful joys. The abortion has only 12 pains, but no joys. Part of how this meaning crisis has come to us is through modernity. Part of what happened in modernity is what I sometimes call the scientific lab leak. In the early moments of the scientific revolution, we figured out that if we in some ways bracket out the mind of God or the agency of God, we can discover what we call natural processes, and in fact, they are reliably predictable. If we begin to imagine that God is not causing spheres to fall from an Italian tower, well, the spheres will always fall at the same rate. No God needed. Part of what Galileo and Copernicus began to discover is that, in fact, what was above the moon, which was the celestial boundary of the classical and medieval order, if the math up there was the same as the math down here, well, then perhaps the entire cosmos was dead, and we are the only living things. We are the only persons ourselves left in the world, and as the modern period continued to develop and, in fact, move around the world and secular societies, basically there was maybe God above and us down below, and once you threw away a God above, well, we're the only real persons that we know of in existence. We're the only creatures that move on purpose, bring ends and reasons to things. And the world around us is either locked in some kind of physicalist determinism, the kind that someone like Sam Harris would tell you is all there is, or it's simply the product of chaos, or in some strange ways, both. Now, brain science has continued to develop over the last number of years, and what a lot of that brain science suggests to us is that, well, perhaps not only the world around us is deterministic, but perhaps even our thoughts are. In the middle of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis pointed out this movement in one of my favorite books of his entitled Miracles, and he entitled this thing The Whole Show. Of course the world is meaningless if it's just one big long chain of cause and effect. And the only other plausible option that is on the plate of many secularists or modernists is that the world is simply chaos. And in such a place, well, if even our own actions or motivations are not purposeful or intentional, well, then there's no purpose that remains. And if there's no purpose that remains, what's the point of living? This is part of what has provoked this nihilistic meaning crisis. Now, in many of my conversations with John Vervaeke, who, again, does not in any way identify as a Christian, but as a non-theist and increasingly as a Neoplatonist, he himself will acknowledge readily that religious people don't seem to be suffering from this meaning crisis the way that non-religious people do. John's project involves trying to assist the development of a religion that's not a religion, something that's scientifically credible yet offers the goods that religion used to offer. And for a great many of you, given who the founders of your conference told me usually attend their conferences, well, this is you. Because if you actually practice your religion, if you actually believe that this world is neither the product of physicalist determinism nor simply chaos, that if there is in fact, if the universe is in fact a product of a willful, benevolent, good creator God, well, then your pursuit of his kingdom and your pursuit of his heart is in fact a tremendously meaningful endeavor that gives you protection against this meaning crisis. This is all good news. He's acknowledged that part of what's happened in the wake of Jordan Peterson's work, Jonathan Pageau's work, my work, and John Vervaeke's work is that a good number of people have in fact returned to organized religions. Many of whom are returning to Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Anglicanism, some of them to the religion that they grew up in, and they're finding shelter from the meaning crisis in their churches, in their religions that they're pursuing. The bad news is that churches are not doing very well. Now, I live in North America, and for a long time, the United States has been an outlier in Western civilization in terms of the practice of religion. Here's a little chart from the General Survey of America's changing religious landscape. The fastest growing group in the United States is the group that identifies with no religion. Now, those of you in Australia have been accustomed to this for a lot longer. More familiar with Canada. I've been to Australia once in 2019. I was invited there by my friend Warren Mills to give a little conference on the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. And from what I could see, Australia is quite a bit more like Europe than the United States. But even in the United States, people are deconstructing, which is the latest word for giving up the faith and, well, embracing who knows what. And here I did a commentary on Audrey Assad, a woman whose music I really enjoy, where she shared her story with Justin Brierley. If you're not familiar with Justin's YouTube channel, Justin's United Kingdom radio show, Unbelievable, it's, I think, for a long time been one of the best sources out there to sort of get a sense of what's going on in the broader conversations between committed Christians and those who are skeptical or pursuing other religions. But many, like Audrey Assad have been deconstructing, and they've been leaving the faith. It's simply for them no longer plausible. Many of them leave the faith and lament, feeling like they have to do so because it just doesn't make sense to them, or it doesn't feel moral anymore to them, or it's just not working for them. And in my experience, what they then become vulnerable to will be, in fact, John Vervaeke's meaning crisis. A couple of scholars have done a fair amount of work about that. One is Clay Rutledge, who himself is an atheist and he's a psychologist, and he's written a book, Supernatural, where he goes into the fact that from all of his research as a social scientist, when people leave organized religion, it's not, as the new atheists would have hoped, they become somehow rational. They don't become rational at all. In fact, they usually believe in more superstitious things, or let's say less mainstream things, such as UFOs, ghosts, witchcraft, black magic, this sort of thing. Tara Isabella Burton has written a very interesting book, Strange Rites, where she chronicles the new religions for a godless world. People, in fact, in recent years have concocted all sorts of new religions, and many of them are imagining they're somehow reviving old, dead forms of paganism. Much of the study that I've seen on that shows that more than that, they're just sort of making things up from the little idiosyncratic bits of historical wreckage from the ends of paganism. Paganism was basically crushed and or assimilated by the various world religions that have been around the globe now. And so a lot of people sort of devolve into superstitions, various ad hoc spiritualities, folk religions, and the like. And over the long term, these might sort of help get them through, try not to feel too meaningless, but people seldom are able to organize, group together, or really do much clear thinking in regards to finding a coherent system within which they can live. So when people throw away their organized religion, they tend to pick up poor replacements in an ad hoc fashion. And we're actually awash in people grabbing onto the wreckage of old religions, trying to regain meaning and enchantment in their lives. Now, all of this is happening at the same time as what I call the recession of modernity. That's an enormous subject in and of itself that I won't get into, but modernity has been receding since the First World War. Now, these are massive things, and they take a tremendous amount of time, just like Christianity didn't disappear with the rise of Darwin or all of the assaults that it has been subjected to over the last few centuries. Modernity isn't simply going to disappear either. These are massive things that move on a very long time span. The rise of new atheism, I think, was parallel to early modernist theologians trying to save Christianity from modernity. In the case of new atheists, they were trying to save their modernity from the rise of postmodernity. And we've seen that in a number of struggles, sometimes circling around this phrase, the intellectual dark web, that Eric Weinstein coined. And Jordan Peterson has been really one of the individuals that has had a reliable nose for, I think, the forefront of those conversations. Now, many brands of postmodernity have been around for a few decades, and despite the current success of what some people call wokeness, I don't think they're going to organize well or finally be able to give people a lot to build on. They're usually incoherent, and people grab onto them sort of in the same way that they grab onto bits and pieces of spirituality to sort of make life work, but it's not a reliable or a stable enough platform to really endure or to establish a civilization upon. I think for that reason, postmodernity really isn't honest enough, or at least the various versions of postmodernities that have been coming down the road and that we've seen as fashionable really won't have much staying power. But when people reject the now, they often look to the past, at least something that seemed to feel like it made sense to them. So with this little meme that I created for Twitter and a video recently, a lot of aging new atheists are not, as we might imagine, looking to Protestantism for their religion into the future. Some are, in fact, looking to far older versions of Christianity, such as Orthodoxy. And part of what we've been seeing in the United States is a rise in interest in Orthodoxy. I don't know if this is the same in Australia. When I was in Australia in 2019, Warren Mills Anglican Church, I went to church with him when I was staying with him to do the conference. And he was in one of these Anglican churches that really hasn't sort of embraced Hillsong music. They're still doing old liturgies and old music. And I told the priest, I said, your day is coming. And he said, it certainly doesn't feel like it. When I first came to Sacramento in the late 90s, myself and another colleague were very active in doing church planting. And at that point, a lot of the ethos of church planting was really in the seeker movement. It was sort of big sound. Back in the day, in fact, the colleague who planted his church in a suburban area around Sacramento, he did the Willow Creek thing where they had the seeker service on Sunday, and then they had the believer service on Wednesday night. All of those church plants that we planted are now doing highly liturgical worship services with weekly communion. That, in fact, I think is where things are heading. And so that poor Anglican priest in Melbourne, Australia, I told him, just hang on. You're moving in the right direction. If in fact trends through the 20th century hold that culture sort of bleeds from California out to the world, including Australia, we will likely continue to see the growth of interest in denominations and liturgies that tend to look ancient. I'm not going to say ancient modern, because modern is in fact the wrong term, more ancient contemporary. We're going to see people wanting a much more sacramental view of the faith. I call these groups neo-sacramentalists. Someone coming to orthodoxy from atheism, however, will not be like someone who inherits it from past generations. I do believe that this is in fact going to reshape orthodoxy in America, and I think in some ways the new Orthodox are going to be quite different from those who inherited orthodoxy from the old world. I've been talking about these kinds of things with quite a few people. Some of my favorite conversations have been with an individual named Rafe Kelly. Rafe Kelly has had a little bit of stardom and success doing parkour. And I discovered him through his friendship with John Vervaeke, and then we began to have some conversations. And Rafe Kelly is the son of, you can find some of his life story on my channel and my conversations with Rafe Kelly. He was the son of basically a hippie commune in the Pacific Northwest. And he was sort of homeschooled by a neighbor who at least taught him to read. And once he could read, he became interested in anthropology. And by the time he got to college, he had already read way more than any of the undergraduates in anthropology. And so basically continued to self-study. And in recent years, he has sort of created a practice of teaching people how to do parkour to sort of put their lives together. The communes that he was raised on often look to sort of a Native American spirituality, but in my conversations with him, he's begun to identify as a non-theistic Christian. He, like many his age, sort of grabbed onto the new atheist movement, but again, like many, discovered Jordan Peterson, basically exposing the nihilism of atheism, and he's been trying to figure out what kind of Christianity would work. And for the most part, we learn how to harvest the culture by the culture itself. If you're an attentive listener, you'll listen to the people that you're reaching out to, and they will tell you what's helpful and what isn't. And basically, I learned from him that I had, in some ways, within the meaning crisis, sort of given a postmodern version of Pascal's wager, and he found this compelling. I derived this basically with my own struggles with modernity and nihilism, because when I looked at postmodernity, I pretty much saw that, well, if nothing matters and there is no meaning, well, then I'm free to embrace any meaning that works for me. And Well, if I embrace the premises of the meaning crisis, it gives me no reason not to believe in Christ's resurrection and the resurrection from the dead. If all there is determinism or chaos, well then, why can't I believe what I want to? People all over are telling me that there's no foundational reason to embrace any specific ought. So, well, if I find it works for me to believe in Christ's resurrection and to live as if Jesus rose from the dead, and if this in fact fills me with meaning and makes me self-sacrificially generous to my neighbors, well, even the world is not going to complain. I'm now freed to pursue Christ. I can pour out his love to my neighbors around me. My neighborhood will be blessed with this love. And in fact, I believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ gives me the power to do so, even if I can't demonstrate it to someone's modernist sensitivity satisfaction. Another favorite author of mine that I've come across in the last few years is Tom Holland, a scholar in the UK. Tom Holland, as a little boy, went to the Anglican Church and immediately became very fascinated with dinosaurs. He tells the story in the preface to his book, Dominion. He'd go to Sunday school and learn about Adam and Eve and hear about dinosaurs and wondered how they all fit together. And his Sunday school teacher didn't quite know how to answer the question. And so he, very much like many people at this time and his age, decided the church doesn't seem to know much. They have no credibility. So he left the church. Well, he grew up and achieved a certain degree of fame and success, basically writing books about the ancient world. But the more he studied the ancient world, the more he began to realize how different the values of the ancient world were from our values today. And that sort of haunted him. The Greeks and the Romans, who he admired, in many ways were brutal people, the kinds of people that none of us would tolerate with our moral systems today, Christian, atheist, or non-Christian. He was paying attention to the rise of ISIS in Syria, Iraq, in that area of the world, and some of the persecution that was going on there. In fact, even contemporary crucifixions. And he was also asking some questions that made a lot of Muslims uncomfortable about the origin story of Islam. In fact, he wrote a book on it, In the Shadow of the Sword, where he basically gave his version for the rise of Islam. When he was doing promotional speeches for that book, he was challenged by some Muslims who were not happy with his book or the arguments he was presenting, and basically said, why are you poking around in our religion? Why don't you do this to your own religion? And he thought, well, I don't really have a religion. But the more he began to explore it, he decided, well, let me take a look at the Christian story. The results of that investigation is the book Dominion, where he basically discovered that Jesus Christ transformed the world. Now, Tom Holland will often say on his better days, maybe he believes in Jesus as the risen Lord, and maybe he believes it's some of these miracles really happened, but he's still in some ways sort of on the fence. But what he discovered, and he said, this no one can really argue with, is that in fact, Jesus transformed the world. And for a number of years, the new atheists have been basically telling Christians, well, you don't meet the standard of your own religion. And, well, that's a fair critique. And anyone who's been around Christians enough, certainly a pastor like me has, you have to admit and acknowledge, yes, we don't. In fact, I don't meet the standards of my own religion on a regular basis. Even atheists embrace Jesus' moral assumptions, even if they don't know they're doing it. It's been so deeply baked into Western secular culture now that, in fact, Jesus wins even if people don't acknowledge that they've basically taken all this stuff from him. Nihilism, however, affords you zero reason to pursue this kind of life. That even nihilists find good, beautiful, and inspirational. A cruciform life is indeed sacrificial and costly, but also joyful and fruitful. Lately, I've been thinking about the phrase in Galatians 5 when the Apostle Paul is contrasting the life of the flesh from the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And Paul, I forgot one in there: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. There are 9, not 8, that I listed there on the slide. And Paul says, against such things there is no law. And the more I reflected on that, the more I saw, here is another little window into the miraculous power of Christ and his resurrection, that if in fact you live by the Spirit, no matter how brutal or tyrannical or godless an administration, they can't live without these things. And for that reason, they can't make any law against them. This is a weapon that we, as Christians, wield or should wield, not the weapons of the world. This world, in fact, has no resistance to this weapon. Now, a lot of what I've done in my videos has been out of my own experience. And as I mentioned, I'm a third-generation Christian Reformed minister, and this is a picture of my father. I, at this time, was maybe not yet born. This is the very early 60s. You can see a little bit of Patterson behind him. Most of the folks in the area of Patterson where I grew up were African Americans who were in some ways fleeing the Jim Crow South, but came to the northern industrial cities for jobs and found other brands of racism there. And so what my father did with his own Christian upbringing, even though I would imagine at that point in his life had very little experience with African American culture, spent the next 36 years pouring himself out for the people who lived in the first ward of Patterson. And I simply grew up imbibing, mapping that from my father. Why would it be reasonable, if you're a young man, to devote your life to such cruciform, selfless service? I watched my father do it year after year, person after person. And sometimes I didn't appreciate it. Sometimes I did. But it deeply imprinted in me really the rationale and the meaning of the resurrection. Because, well, the resurrection has always allowed the church to take the most audacious risks. Everything in our culture says the only thing worth living for is to have all the best experiences now. What's amazing is that experience is something you can't really put in a bottle. You can't really hold on to. You can't really justify. In fact, as your life flashes by, experiences become memories. The resurrection says, pour out your life for the kingdom of God. Pour out your life for the welfare of others. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself in a sacrificial way. And I think in many ways, the message of Jesus is, if you live like me, you will die like me, and I will raise you like I was risen. And in fact, in Christ's resurrection, I believe if we look at what the book of Colossians says about Christ, he came to us in the flesh of creation 1.0, and when he walked out of the tomb, and as he sits at the right hand of God the Father, he wears the flesh of creation 2.0. That is his promise to us. That is the guarantee that he gives us by his Spirit. His Spirit that gives us this weapon that the world cannot match. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. I love Jim Elliot's framing of it. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. When I entered the ministry and when I came to Sacramento, I met a number of pastors, some of whom, by the time they reached the end of their vocation, were fed up. I remember one minister telling me how he worked very hard to make sure his son didn't follow him into the ministry because it wasn't worth it. There wasn't enough money. The people in the church were too mean-spirited, too ungrateful, etc., etc. And I began to see people who basically didn't believe in it after living a life pursuing it. I never found that in my father. I remember he died in 2013 of a sudden heart attack. He died sitting around a table, sitting across from a young man. He had been retired for a number of years, sitting across a young man who needed to talk to someone in a coffee shop. And the waitress asked him for coffee. He paused, had a heart attack, and died. And I told my mother, he loved sitting down and meeting people over coffee. And he left this world at one table and came into the banquet of the Lamb almost immediately. I remember asking him towards the end of his life, because after retirement, he stopped having to do the formal ministry as a paid vocation, which he had done for his career, and now in retirement had twice as many Bible studies and all kinds of people he would meet with, and rather confused my mother because I thought retirement was going to be different. I told my mom, Mom, you know how he is. This is his life. And so I asked him towards the end of his life, Dad, what do you think? He says, I love it more than ever. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. It's not an argument that inspires us to believe this as much as the beauty of a saint, of a Christian, someone who is living it, who understands that, most of the people my father helped would go on to have additional hurts and struggles that he couldn't rescue them out of. He bore witness to something. He died in Massachusetts, which is a state on the east coast of the United States. We had a memorial service there, and I was given the opportunity to speak at his second memorial service, which we did in Patterson. Person after person after person coming up to me, both in Massachusetts and New Jersey, telling me about what my father had done for them. And I thought, is there any better way to live a life? If this meaning crisis is true, if the world is just sound and fury signifying nothing, why not live this way? Even if the atheists say there's no reason to do so, they can't deny the beauty of such a life. It's full of meaning. It's full of joy. Glory begins. And to me, those are the best arguments that this is not a foolish way to live. This is the only way to live. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jesus was not showing us stupidity or futility. He was showing us glory. That's what the Gospel of John says. Now, the church, your church, my church, continues to have everything it needs. Yes, we've got problems with deconstruction. Yes, if the church has always had problems. Read the New Testament. Look at the church at Corinth. Read John's letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. Churches always have problems, but the church always has everything it needs. The story is the same in every generation. We do just need to live it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the way up to and including your enemy. We just have to figure out what love looks like. And there's the challenge. How do we love? How do we love this difficult person in a difficult situation? How do we love when everything in our life screams to be selfish and grab whatever short-term pleasures we can right now? Jordan Peterson, one of his best rules for life is do what is meaningful, not what's expedient. That's a good rule. Part of the strange conglomerations of people in my new YouTube experience is a channel coming out of the UK called Rebel Wisdom. They, like John Vervaeke, are not Christian. Some of the individuals running it grew up in the church and found it wanting, and so do men's work and pursue a lot of interesting philosophy and quasi-religion. They recently had a conversation with Megan Dahm, who has been doing some of these things in a parallel fashion in the United States. And what's amazing to me is that where both David Fuller and Megan Dahm winded up was what we really need are small, off-camera communities where people can talk together to speak their truth and work through that stuff with each other. Soon after I started making Jordan Peterson videos, I started going out to lunch with random people in Sacramento that saw my videos and wanted to talk to me. They didn't really see much point in coming to church. They didn't feel that the church would offer them much of anything. But, well, even though I'm a pastor, I seem to be interested in what they're interested in, and what they discovered was that they were having difficulty finding meaningful conversation partners. And so, as I said, the harvest will teach you how to harvest it. A number of those people said, well, why don't you start a meetup? Meetup.com. Okay. So I got a meetup.com account and I started a meetup. And even after years of doing Vacation Bible School, harvest festivals, all these stock evangelical tricks to try to get people through the door, most of which didn't work hardly at all. The first time I put a little advert up on meetup.com to, well, let's talk about Jordan Peterson's work and what's going on. Boom. 12 people came. Well, let's do it another month. Boom. Another dozen people came. The thing just continued. In fact, in some ways, it's continued so much, I couldn't kill it if I wanted to. The members of that meetup decided they wanted to start a Discord server. And very quickly, we had a couple of thousand people signed up to participate in that. That's basically chat rooms online. And I began to discover that there's a lot of appetite for authentic, honest conversation. People need to talk about their stuff. One of my rules for doing small group studies in the church was always, you're not going to lose status in our study by saying the wrong thing. This needs to be, in many ways, a safe space for talking. Because if you're going to process truthfully, you're going to have to speak your truth. Part of the reason people were skeptical that church could offer them anything at all was because church was most often talking at people. Churches are known as places where maybe you can find a handout or a helping hand in terms of some diaconal or benevolence request. And we've done that for years here. But what people really wanted was an honest conversation. And when I asked a number of the atheists, because eventually I began to start up a network of these groups, and that's my estuary project, there's some in Australia that are working it as well. I began asking the atheists in my group, is it good that we do this in a church? And it was the atheists that were telling me, yeah, the church is the best place to do this because maybe people will take these conversations more seriously if there's a cross up on the wall. Oh, okay. the harvest will teach you how to harvest it. What if churches were known as places where you could reliably find satisfying conversation about what's most important in life? Now, I believe that there are many good clergy out there that in fact do this. And if my experience, my father's experience, my grandfather's experience has anything to teach me, it's that people sometimes have, once they get to know the pastor, a degree of confidence that they can actually have a real conversation with a pastor, but they're unsure about the church. What if, in fact, we decided that churches would be good places where someone could come and stand a reasonable chance of having an honest, satisfying conversation, and that a community could be built around that? One of the differences between Jesus and John the Baptist, Josephus tells us that John the Baptist had a huge following, which lasted a couple of 100 years. It's pretty remarkable. Jesus is still going. Why? What did Jesus do? He built a church around people. Broken people, sinful people, fallible people, all of that. We all know that's true in the church. But it's in fact the communion of the saints that is witness to the King of Kings. In a recent Jordan Peterson video where he was at the Cambridge Union in the UK, someone asked him what he's learned. He had an extended absence via illness. The culture war drama that he raised destroyed his career as a university lecturer, destroyed his career as a clinical psychologist. Now he's just sort of a public intellectual, doing very well financially, but selling books and doing talks. And basically asserted something I knew from my marriage and counseling practice. Maybe I'll play you the video because I think it speaks well.
So you talked a bit about how your view on relationships has changed. And since you talked at the Union 3 years ago, how have your other opinions changed and why?
Well, one thing that's changed, most of this is a deepening, I would say, rather than a transformation of beliefs. But it's a deepening and a specification of things that I more dimly apprehended before. One of the things I've really learned more explicitly, I would say, in the last 6 months is to not win. I knew this already. Like in my clinical practice, I tried my best not to be right. So for example, as a clinician, you can dispense advice, and so it'd be quite easy, especially if I wasn't suffering at that time while practicing as a clinician, and the person was, I think, well, I've got my life together pretty well, and I'll just tell you what you should do. And sometimes people would ask for that, right? But it's not that helpful because, well, what the hell do you know about what they should do? You can introduce topics of conversation like, well, most people have friends and you don't seem to have any, and, maybe you have a reason for that, and maybe it's a, fundamentally valid reason, and that's not where your interests are oriented. Maybe you're particularly introverted, which doesn't mean you don't need friends. But that's way different than saying, well, here's what you should do. And the problem with here's what you should do is, first of all, as the psychoanalysts knew, you just set up resistances in people. And the reason, so they won't do it, even if they want your advice, and often they'll do the opposite, just out of spite, and probably they should, because they're basically saying, up yours. It's like, this is my life, man, not yours. And the other problem with advice is, well, let's say you take my advice, and then you go do something good. It's like, well, whose victory is that? Is it yours or mine? So did I just steal your victory? Well, that's not so good. And so I learned that pretty thoroughly as a clinician, not to do that, and hopefully as a husband and father, also not to do that. But in my talks with people like Sam Harris, I was more instrumental than I should have been. There were points I was trying to make, and I was trying to be right. And there's times for that, and there's partisan situations where only one side can win and another side has to lose. An election is like that. But I've really learned, I hope, that in the last 6 or 7 months to not do that, not to do that. And so The last conversation I had with Sam Harris, which was 2 weeks ago, which will be released in relatively short order, was by far the best conversation we ever had. And all I did was ask him questions. And that wasn't manipulative. It wasn't like, well, I'm going to, and no one has here in the audience has done this yet, but lots of times people ask me questions. They're not questions. They're disguised criticisms, or they're statements of belief, or they're an observation that perhaps if my Christian beliefs, for example, were more fully differentiated, and I accepted Christ as my Savior, that would be a good thing. That comes up quite often. And they're not questions. Like a question is something you want the answer to. Like actually, you want to know what the person thinks. And so all I did was ask Harris questions. And I learned all sorts of things about the way he thought that I didn't know, and about commonalities in our approach to problems that I didn't understand. And the conversation was much more enjoyable. I mean, the give and take of our previously more tendentious conversations had, what would you say? There was an element of sort of combative enjoyment to them. So they weren't nothing, and they were reasonably successful as public spectacles, and I suppose as philosophical investigations, but this was way better. And I understood what motivated Sam way more than I did before. And I've been doing a lot of, I hope, political peacemaking between Democrats and Republicans.
Even though I believe, and I do, that the truth has been revealed to us in Jesus Christ, it's often the case, as the old saying goes, that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think there's a great deal that we can learn from this, because so often, again, people find compelling, people find credible what they find to be beautiful and what they find to be true. In the Christian church, we are the people of the resurrection. We, more than anyone else, ought to feel optimistic, more secure, and better about the future. Why? Because he walked out of that tomb. I think G.K. Chesterton said it really well. Christianity, are you concerned about it? Are you seeing deconstruction? Are you troubled by how weak and impotent the church seems to be? Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave.